Sometimes, the smallest things change everything. A glint of green, a question spoken aloud, a truth that can no longer be buried. That's how it began, with a waitress, a ring, and the man who didn't know his past had just walked up to his table. And at table 9 sat Admiral Richard Hale, silver-haired, spine straight, dressed in ceremonial whites like he was born in them. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence alone drew sideways glances and standing posture from junior officers who understood what it meant when a man had weathered both war and whispers. Across the room, Emma Brooks balanced a tray of water glasses with the kind of grace you only earn from 1,000 shifts on your feet. At 26, she'd learned the rhythm of this place, where to pause, where to disappear, when to smile. She wore the uniform, white blouse, black apron, but beneath the crisp fabric were calluses, late-night bus rides, and a life her guests could never imagine. She didn't notice him at first. Not until she turned, and the green glint caught her eye. A ring bold and ornate, worn with the casual authority of someone who never took it off. Her breath hitched. That ring. The same shape, the same stone, the same impossible color as the one tucked in her mother's velvet box at home. A ring her mother never wore but never let go of either. One tied to stories never told, and a sorrow too sharp to explain. Emma's body moved on autopilot, but her mind spun. Her mother's voice echoed in memory. This belonged to someone I once knew. Someone who mattered. Once. And now, that same ring was here, on the hand of a man whose world seemed galaxies away from hers. She reached the table. Her hands didn't shake, but something in her chest did. She leaned forward. The glasses settled on the linen with a soft clink. Then, before she could stop herself, the words left her mouth. "Sir, my mother has a ring just like yours." The Admiral's hand paused mid-reach. His eyes met hers, sharp, suddenly unmoored. In that moment, all the weight of his metals seemed to land in his stare. Around them, the club carried on forks against china, murmured orders for brandy, but at this table, time cracked open. And for Emma Brooks, this shift had just become something else entirely. Not about service. Not about routine. About the beginning of a truth she had never meant to uncover. The words still echoed in Emma's ears as she stood in the quiet of her apartment, the sounds of the officers' club now a distant hum in her memory. She had taken the long way home, hoping the cold night air would dull the rush of adrenaline still pulsing through her. But it hadn't. Not even close. The image of Admiral Hale's eyes, startled, locked on hers, kept flashing in her mind like a silent alarm she couldn't turn off. She kicked off her shoes, shrugged out of her coat, and stood in the small living room lit by a single floor lamp. The apartment smelled faintly of chamomile and old pages. Her mother always left tea to steep too long. Claire's bedroom door was open, and the soft glow of her reading light spilled into the hallway. Emma hesitated before stepping forward, her heart beating loud enough to drown out reason. She wasn't sure what she was about to ask, only that she had to. Claire Brooks sat propped against pillows, a paperback resting face down on her lap, eyes closed behind her glasses. Her face was softer in sleep, lines drawn not from age, but from long-held worry. Emma watched her for a moment, wondering how many truths lived behind that worn, gentle face. Then she cleared her throat. Claire blinked awake, startled, and gave a tired smile. "Long shift?" she asked, removing her glasses. Emma didn't answer. She crossed the room slowly, like she was walking into a memory that didn't belong to her. "I saw a man today," she said. "At the club." Her voice cracked slightly. "He was wearing a ring, an emerald one. Just like yours." For a second, Claire didn't move. Her smile faltered, then vanished entirely. She reached for the side table, turned off the lamp, then turned it back on again, a nervous habit Emma had seen only a handful of times. "That's not something I expected to hear," Claire said finally. Her tone was quiet, but the air between them thickened instantly. "What did you say to him?" Emma shrugged, but her eyes were fixed. "I told him my mother has a ring just like it." She expected laughter. A scoff. Denial. Instead, Her mother closed the book and set it aside like something fragile was about to be opened. Claire rose from the bed and walked toward the hallway closet. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one pulling at something buried beneath years of silence. She reached up to the top shelf, standing on her toes, and pulled down a small, dusty box wrapped in a faded gray scarf. Emma hadn't seen it in years. She remembered the way her mother used to open it late at night when she thought Emma was asleep. The box was velvet, dark navy blue with soft edges worn from time. Claire held it in her palms for a long moment, as though weighing something heavier than gold. "This isn't a story I wanted to tell you like this," she whispered. "But I suppose it was always going to find its way out." She sat at the edge of the bed and opened the box. Inside, the ring gleamed, identical to the one on the Admiral's hand. Oval-cut emerald, gold band, a halo of tiny diamonds around the stone. Emma felt her breath catch. She'd seen it before, yes, but tonight it meant something new. Tonight it felt like a missing piece. Claire didn't look at the ring. She looked at her daughter. "It was his," she said softly. "A man I knew when I was just a few years older than you are now." Her voice trembled, but never broke. "He was in the Navy. Stationed here for only 3 months." Emma sat across from her, still as stone. "What happened?" she asked. Claire exhaled, like the question hurt. "I was working nights at a diner near the base. He came in for coffee one evening, white uniform, sharp eyes, the kind of man who made the world feel quieter just by looking at you. His name was Richard. He never said his last name, and I never asked." She shook her head slightly. "We weren't built to last." Emma felt the name strike something inside her, but she said nothing. Her mother continued, voice growing distant. "It was fast. Intense. We talked about the future once, maybe twice. But mostly we talked like we didn't have one. When his deployment orders came, I walked him to the bus. He gave me the ring, said he'd come back. Said I should wear it until he did. But he didn't come back," Emma said quietly. Claire nodded. "And I never heard from him again." She closed the box and set it between them. "I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks later." Emma blinked slowly, her throat tight. The truth hung between them like fog, and she could see now why it had been kept sealed all these years. Claire had chosen to protect her, and perhaps herself, too. But that didn't make it hurt any less. "Why didn't you ever try to find him?" Emma asked. Her mother smiled sadly. "There are some questions we learn to live without answers to." She reached for Emma's hand. "And I didn't want you chasing ghosts." But Emma wasn't chasing a ghost. She had seen the man, Admiral Richard Hale, sitting in crisp whites, wearing the other half of a forgotten promise. "He's not a ghost," Emma whispered. "He's alive. I served him today." Claire froze. Her eyes, wide and glassy, met Emma's. "What did you say his name was?" "I didn't. But I saw his nameplate." Emma's voice dropped. "Admiral Richard Hale." Claire didn't speak for a long time. Her hands trembled. She pressed them to her mouth as if holding in years of uncried tears. "I never knew," she whispered. "I never thought." They sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of traffic outside their window. Emma could feel the weight of the world shifting, not all at once, but in slow, undeniable turns. A truth uncovered. A wound reopened. A story that no longer belonged only to the past. Later that night, unable to sleep, Emma rose quietly and rummaged through the storage bin beneath her bed. She dug until her fingers brushed old photo albums and a cracked leather case filled with childhood mementos. In the back of one album, tucked behind the plastic sleeve, she found a photograph she didn't remember taking. It showed her mother, younger, radiant, standing beside a man in a white uniform. She looked closer. The man had sandy blonde hair, strong features, and a quiet confidence in his smile. His hand was on Claire's waist. He wore a gold band with a green stone. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, the photo trembling in her grip. She didn't need to ask if it was him. She already knew. The quiet of his office offered no peace that night. The Admiral sat behind his polished mahogany desk, staring at the crystal decanter half full with bourbon untouched. The sounds of the city, distant horns, the occasional siren, were nothing compared to the one voice that wouldn't leave his ears. "Sir, my mother has a ring just like yours." It echoed again and again, each time peeling back another layer of armor he'd spent a lifetime building. He had heard hundreds of strange remarks over the years, but this one struck with surgical precision. It wasn't just the words, but the way she'd said them, like she didn't quite believe she was saying them aloud. Her eyes had locked on his with something more than curiosity. Recognition? No, it was something deeper, something like inheritance. Admiral Richard Hale leaned back slowly, exhaling a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his chest for 20 years. The ring on his hand felt heavier now, colder. He turned it absently, the emerald catching the lamplight just so. He had worn it for decades, not out of vanity, but out of memory. A promise. Or perhaps a penance. He rose from his chair, moving with practiced stillness toward the bookshelf that lined the far wall. Tucked behind a row of old naval strategy texts was a brass key, small and unassuming. He retrieved it and walked to the tall, double-door cabinet against the back wall, one he hadn't opened in years. The lock clicked, metal grinding softly as the door creaked open. Inside, everything was where he'd left it. A faded journal, bound in cracked brown leather, sat on the top shelf beside an old photograph in a tarnished silver frame. He ignored the photo and took the journal instead, cradling it like something sacred. Its pages were yellowed, the spine worn to softness. This wasn't a record of battles or deployments. This was personal. A secret history he'd only ever written for himself. He settled back into his chair and opened to a page marked by a folded piece of stationery. The letter was creased and unfinished, the ink slightly smudged as if written with a shaking hand. It was addressed simply, Claire. No last name. No rank. Just the name of a woman he never forgot and never forgave himself for leaving behind. He began reading aloud, voice low and unfamiliar in the silence. "Claire, I don't expect you to read this. I don't even know if I'll send it. But I owe you more than silence." His throat tightened. He stopped reading. Even now, the words felt dangerous. He remembered her perfectly coffee-stained uniform, dimpled smile, the way she listened like every word mattered. They had only a handful of weeks before he was shipped out. It hadn't felt like enough time to fall in love, but he had. Completely. And when the orders came, he left anyway. The memory stung worse now. He could justify it then: career, duty, legacy. But in the years since, he had come to understand that some choices weren't noble. They were cowardly. Especially when they left someone waiting in silence. He turned to the journal's last written entry, dated over 20 years ago. "Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I stayed." That sentence was all it said. No answer. Just the weight of a question that had never let him go. Now, that same question stood in front of him, alive, breathing, and calling herself Emma. He said her name aloud, testing it on his tongue like a secret not meant for daylight. Emma, the syllables lingered. Not foreign. Not new. He didn't know why it felt familiar, but it did. He rose again and returned to the cabinet. This time, he pulled out the photograph, Claire, standing outside a cafe in a navy blue dress, sunlight in her hair. He remembered taking it on his last weekend before deployment. She hadn't known he snapped it. She was laughing. He closed his eyes, pressing the photo to his chest. All the years he'd spent telling himself she'd moved on, and now he wondered if that had ever been true. Could she have raised a child without telling him? A daughter? That daughter? The math added up. Too perfectly. He glanced back at the journal, now resting open on the desk. The handwriting looked like someone else's now, someone younger, more afraid, but pretending not to be. That man had written promises he never intended to break. And yet, here he was 60 years old, uniform still sharp, metals still polished, and completely unprepared for the storm one sentence had unleashed. He sat back down, staring at the photo beside the ring. The question turned over again in his mind like a tide he couldn't stop. What if I have a daughter? What if I've had one all along? His hand curled into a fist. Not from anger. From fear. The kind of fear that came when time runs out, and you realize the one thing you never made room for might be the only thing that mattered. He looked down at the emerald ring. A gift from her, meant to be a reminder. Instead, It had become a monument to regret. And now, worn on both their hands, it had become something else. A thread. He didn't know what he would do yet. He wasn't sure if he could reach out, if she'd even want him to. But he knew this. The past had come calling. And for once, he wasn't going to ignore it. Emma, he whispered again. The name tasted like guilt and grace all at once. And deep inside, something began to stir, not duty, not command, but a need far more human. He folded the letter and placed it inside the journal. Then he locked the cabinet again, not to hide the past, but to preserve it. The next steps couldn't be written here. They would have to be lived. And maybe, if the door wasn't already closed, he could walk through it one last time. If you were Admiral Hale, would you reach out and admit the truth, or would you let the past stay buried? Let us know in the comments below. Your thoughts might just help someone else facing their own unfinished chapter. The following morning, the officers' club felt unchanged, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, white uniforms moving like clockwork, the hum of quiet conversations about duty and politics. But to Emma, everything was different now. Every polished surface seemed to reflect the same image she couldn't shake, Admiral Hale's face, startled beneath the chandelier light. She had spoken without thinking, but the moment had settled into her like a splinter. And no matter how many times she told herself it was just coincidence, she couldn't believe it anymore. The morning rush began as usual, her steps quick and practiced, but her focus fractured. She carried trays, refilled glasses, answered politely, all while her mind circled the same thought. What if it's him? She hadn't told her mother that she'd decided to work another shift that day, that she needed to see him again. Needed to know. Every instinct told her that fate wasn't done with her yet. When Admiral Hale arrived, he looked as composed as always, though there was a tightness in his posture that hadn't been there before. He nodded to the maitre d', exchanged brief words, and took his usual seat at table 9. His ring gleamed faintly under the afternoon light, as if mocking them both. Emma felt her pulse quicken. She told herself she wouldn't stare, and then she did anyway. For his part, the Admiral tried not to notice her. Tried and failed. Each time she passed, something in his gaze flickered, not the cool, distant authority of command, but a quiet searching, a recognition he couldn't quite place. He told himself he was imagining it. Yet when she turned and met his eyes, he felt that same chill again, not fear, but familiarity. Their silent standoff became a rhythm neither could escape. She moved with purpose, avoiding his table until she couldn't. He watched without meaning to, his mind running circles around the possibilities. Who is she really? Why did her voice, that voice, echo through his thoughts at night? The more he tried to dismiss it, the louder the question became. And behind it all, that single name still haunted him, Claire. By noon, the club was nearly full, but for Hale, the noise faded into background static. His attention kept drifting to the girl in the black apron and white blouse, her hair tied neatly, her movements precise. He noticed how she lingered when setting glasses, how her eyes darted toward him before she caught herself. She was careful, controlled. Yet every now and then, something raw slipped through, a flicker of curiosity, of emotion too long restrained. Emma felt it too. The strange pull she didn't understand, the weight of questions pressing harder with every moment she stood within his reach. Once, when she brought him his order, black coffee, no sugar, their fingers brushed. It was only for an instant, but her breath caught anyway. He thanked her softly, and that voice, low, measured, familiar, cut straight through her composure. She tried to steady herself by remembering her mother's words. He left. That's all that matters. But was it? If this man sitting before her was the one who left, didn't she deserve to know why? She thought of the emerald ring in her mother's drawer, of nights spent wondering why love could leave and never look back. Every instinct screamed at her to demand the truth, but she couldn't, not yet. Not until she was sure. Across the room, Admiral Hale forced himself to focus on the documents in front of him, reports, schedules, numbers that refused to stay still. Duty was supposed to be his refuge, but today even discipline felt like a stranger. He caught sight of her reflection in the window and, without realizing it, stopped writing. There was something in the way she carried herself, not timid, not defiant, just quietly certain, like someone who had inherited strength from pain. For the rest of the afternoon, the air between them grew heavy with everything neither dared to say. Emma served other tables, but her gaze kept drifting back to his, as though gravity itself demanded it. And he, bound by guilt and uncertainty, could no longer pretend she was just another face in a white blouse. Once, when she turned away, he almost called her name. But he didn't know yet which name belonged to her, the one she used, or the one she might carry unknowingly in his heart. Later, as the crowd thinned and sunlight spilled across the club's polished floors, their paths crossed again. Emma was clearing a nearby table when he rose to leave. She looked up, startled, but he hesitated by his chair. For a second, he seemed about to speak, lips parting, brow drawn, then thought better of it. The silence between them was deafening. He left a tip beneath his coffee cup, as always, but this time, a folded napkin rested beside it. Emma didn't notice until he was gone. When she picked it up, her pulse skipped. There was a single line written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "Thank you for your service today." Nothing more. Yet somehow, it felt like both acknowledgement and avoidance. That night, Emma walked home under the orange glow of streetlights, her thoughts restless and loud. She could still see his expression when she'd spoken to him days before, could still feel the way his gaze lingered like he was seeing a ghost. Maybe her mother was right, maybe some stories were better left buried. But the photograph she had found said otherwise. The truth was there, waiting, and she was beginning to suspect it wouldn't stay silent much longer. Meanwhile, back in his apartment, Admiral Hale poured himself a drink he didn't want. The amber liquid swirled, catching the lamplight like molten regret. He replayed every word, every glance, every tremor in her voice when she'd first spoken to him. It wasn't coincidence, he knew that now. And yet, saying it aloud would change everything. He had built a career on clarity, but this was something no compass could navigate. He couldn't confront her without proof, couldn't ask questions that might unravel decades of quiet concealment. Still, the ache in his chest told him the truth already lived inside him. He thought of the journal again, the letter to Claire, the promises left unsent. And for the first time in years, the Admiral felt small. The next morning, he returned to the club, his movements deliberate but unsteady. He told himself it was out of habit, that he simply enjoyed the atmosphere. But when he walked in and saw her again, laughing faintly with another server, sunlight catching in her hair, he knew better. He took his usual seat, but the world around him no longer felt familiar. The ring on his finger seemed to pulse with memory. Emma noticed him instantly, though she tried not to. She felt the same electric unease, the same invisible string pulling tight between them. When their eyes met, neither looked away this time. His expression had changed, less rigid, almost remorseful. But before she could approach, another officer joined him, breaking the spell. Through the corner of his eye, Hale watched her retreat behind the counter, pretending to polish a glass. He listened half-heartedly to the conversation at his table, nodding when required. But his mind was elsewhere, tracing the shape of her features, the echo of someone he used to know. The resemblance was uncanny now that he allowed himself to see it. The tilt of her head, the way her brow furrowed when deep in thought, Claire's daughter, through and through. When his companion finally left, Hale remained seated, lost in a fog of realization and regret. The maitre d' approached politely, asking if he needed anything. The Admiral hesitated, then spoke quietly, almost as if the words were classified. "Tell me," he said, "the name of the young woman who served this table yesterday, and again today." The maitre d' blinked, caught off guard by the request, but quickly recovered. "Of course, Admiral. That would be Miss Emma Brooks." Hale nodded, expression unreadable. But before the man could step away, something compelled him to ask again. "Full name, please." The maitre d' smiled. "Emma Claire Brooks, sir." The sound hit like a physical blow. The Admiral's hand trembled, and the crystal glass he was holding slipped from his grasp. It hit the table's edge and shattered, shards scattering across the linen like fragments of a life he'd long pretended was over. The room fell silent for a beat, every eye turning toward him. But the Admiral didn't move. All he could do was stare at the emerald ring on his finger and whisper the name that had already rewritten everything he thought he knew. Emma Claire Brooks. Emma didn't wait for the next day. As soon as she returned home from the club, she dropped her bag by the door and called out her mother's name. Claire was in the kitchen, sipping tea like nothing had changed, like the weight Emma carried inside her chest wasn't crushing. But Emma couldn't hold it anymore, not after hearing her name come from the Admiral's lips like a memory finally remembered. "Mom," Emma said sharply, voice steadier than she felt, "we need to talk." Claire looked up, startled, the mug halfway to her lips. There was a beat, a pause that lasted longer than it should have before she set the cup down. "What is it?" she asked, but Emma could already see the tension forming around her eyes. "It's about the ring," Emma said. "And Admiral Richard Hale." Claire didn't speak. Not at first. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, knuckles paling, her shoulders rigid. For a moment, she looked like a woman preparing for a wave she had long feared would one day arrive. "What about him?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but tight. Emma didn't flinch. "You knew him, didn't you?" she said. "Back then, when you were my age." She watched her mother's eyes shift, filling with something between grief and resignation. "He wore the same ring, Mom. The same one you've kept hidden for years." Her voice cracked. "And he said my name." Claire turned away, walking to the window like she could outrun the question. Outside, the sky was fading into soft blues and quiet golds. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if bracing for the cold, even though the apartment was warm. "He wasn't supposed to still be here," she whispered. "Not in this city. Not in my daughter's life." Emma's heart thundered. "Then you did know him." Her mother nodded slowly, shoulders sinking. "His name was Richard," Claire said. "We met the summer I turned 23. Her voice was softer now, as if the memories came laced with both sweetness and sorrow. Claire moved to the kitchen table and sat down slowly, motioning for Emma to do the same. "I was working at a diner near the naval base, long hours, not a lot of tips, but enough to get by. He came in one night, still in uniform, hair a little damp from the rain. Ordered coffee and sat in the corner booth. Didn't say much at first." "But he came back?" Emma asked. Claire nodded, her eyes distant. "Every night for almost 2 weeks. I thought he was just another officer passing through, but there was something different about him. He listened when I talked. Asked about my dreams. Smiled like it mattered." The memory softened her features. She almost smiled, but it vanished before it fully formed. "We started seeing each other after hours. Walks by the harbor. Long talks that always ended too soon. He never rushed. Never treated me like a secret." Emma listened, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her mother looked both younger and older all at once, like the memory had peeled her back to a version of herself she'd never shown before. "He gave you the ring," Emma said quietly. "Did he ask you to wait for him?" Claire hesitated. "He said he'd be back," she replied. Said it with the kind of certainty that makes you believe in impossible things. "I wore the ring for months after he left. Kept looking at the door, waiting for a letter, a sign. But it never came." Emma's voice was small. "Did he know you were pregnant?" "No," Claire said, shaking her head slowly. "I didn't even know until a few weeks after he left. I thought about writing, but I didn't have an address. He never told me where he was going. Just that he'd find his way back." "But he didn't," Emma whispered. "No," Claire said again. "He didn't." Her voice grew tight. "And I hated him for it. Not right away, that came later. After the months stretched into years and the silence never broke." The kitchen felt heavier now. Emma stared at the ring on her mother's finger, the one that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. It wasn't just a relic, it was a wound. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked. "Why keep it a secret all this time?" Claire's eyes filled, but no tears fell. "Because I didn't want you growing up with a half-finished story," she said. "I didn't want you wondering why he left, or if it was your fault. I didn't want him to disappoint you the way he disappointed me." She looked down at her hands. "I thought I was protecting you." Emma's voice shook. "But you weren't." Claire flinched, just slightly. "You were protecting yourself." That silence stretched again, thick and raw. The kind of silence that only comes from truths too long unspoken. Maybe, Claire admitted. Maybe I wasn't ready to face it either. She reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Emma's. He didn't know, Emma, she said softly. Whatever else he did or didn't do, he didn't know about you. Emma looked down, her voice barely audible. You said he never knew. But, she swallowed, heart pounding as the words took shape. What if he does now? Claire's breath caught. The question hung between them like a storm cloud, full of charge and promise. She didn't ask what Emma meant. Didn't need to. Because, deep down, something in her already knew. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed the way you saw everything? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else find clarity in their own. The next morning, Emma stood in line at the pharmacy with a small DNA test kit clutched in her hand. It felt like something out of a movie, surreal and unspoken, but there it was, tangible proof of a question that refused to die quietly. She hadn't told Claire. Not yet. She wasn't sure if she ever would, unless the results confirmed what her instincts already screamed. She walked home with the package in her bag, her chest heavy with uncertainty. Each step echoed louder than the last, as if the pavement itself were asking, "Are you ready for the answer?" Once inside, she closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it with her eyes shut. This wasn't just about biology. This was about identity, about rewriting the beginning of a story she'd lived for 26 years. The test itself was simple, a swab, a seal, a label. Too easy for something so big. She completed it in silence, the way one might perform a ritual, reverent, focused, trembling. When she dropped the envelope into the mailbox at the corner, it was as though the wind shifted. Like she'd just whispered a secret to the universe, and it had heard her. Back at the club, the weight of what she'd done pressed in from all sides. Admiral Hale had returned to his usual table like clockwork, but nothing felt routine anymore. Emma moved through the room with practiced grace, but her mind was not on water glasses or menus. It was on him. On the ring. On the way he looked at her now, less like a stranger, more like someone searching for something he'd lost. She approached his table slowly, a pitcher in her hand and a question on her lips. "Another coffee, Admiral?" she asked, her tone light but probing. He glanced up, nodded once, and gave a polite smile. But his fingers tapped restlessly against the table, and his eyes lingered just a moment too long. It wasn't fear. It was recognition, still unspoken. "Did you always know you wanted to serve?" she asked as she poured, her voice casual. The Admiral raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the shift in tone. "It was expected," he replied after a pause. "My father served. His father too. I followed the path laid in front of me." Emma nodded, forcing a smile as she set the coffee down. "And what did you give up to follow it?" The question hung between them like a challenge dressed in curiosity. Hale stiffened slightly, the smile fading just enough to notice. "That's not something I often consider," he said. But his voice betrayed him, just barely. "Sometimes," Emma said quietly, "it's the things we don't consider that leave the biggest mark." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked away, her pulse loud in her ears. She didn't know what had come over her, but every time she stood near him, the need for answers felt louder than fear. Like something alive inside her was tired of being silent. For the next few days, their interactions became more layered. Small talk edged with meaning. Shared glances that lingered just a little too long. He'd ask her how she was, but never casually. And she'd answer, but never without a question hidden beneath. Once, when refilling his water, she asked, "Have you ever regretted not reaching out to someone when you had the chance?" Hale looked up, startled. "Why do you ask?" he said. Emma shrugged, but her eyes didn't waver. "Just curious," she said. But inside, she was screaming. Admiral Hale had spent his entire life decoding threats, reading subtext, detecting tension. And he could feel it now, building between them like a storm waiting for its first strike. He started watching her more closely, not out of suspicion, but out of fear. The kind of fear that grows when truth feels closer than you want it to be. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know when or how much it would cost him. Emma, meanwhile, counted down the days until the results would arrive. The waiting gnawed at her. She found herself walking faster, speaking less, pulling away even when she didn't mean to. Claire noticed the shift, but didn't push, not yet. Emma suspected she already knew why her daughter seemed both closer and further away than ever before. One evening, Claire made dinner, a quiet peace offering of pasta and garlic bread. Emma pushed food around her plate, appetite lost in the fog of waiting. "You've been somewhere else lately," Claire said gently. Emma looked up, startled. "I'm fine," she lied. Claire didn't push. But that night, Emma couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the days on her fingers like prayers. She was caught between two truths, the one she had grown up believing and the one that might change everything. She thought of Hale's silence, his glance, the weight of the ring he never took off. She thought of the ring in her mother's drawer, its twin, of the photograph tucked into her journal, and the man who stood beside her mother in that photo, smiling like he belonged. She had never felt more sure of anything. And yet, the thought of being wrong made her stomach twist. A week later, the envelope arrived. No ceremony. Just a small, sealed package dropped quietly through the mail slot. She froze when she saw it. For a moment, she just stood there, barefoot in the hallway, the morning light stretching toward her like it too was holding its breath. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. She carried the envelope to her bedroom like it might shatter. She placed it on the nightstand and stepped back. Didn't touch it. Couldn't. It was the answer she had asked for, and suddenly, she didn't know if she was ready to hear it. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped tightly, staring at the thin white seal. The silence pressed in like a second skin. All the possibilities rushed at her: relief, anger, validation, heartbreak. What if it says yes? What if it says no? Either way, nothing would be the same again. She didn't open it. Not yet. The envelope sat where she left it, unopened, untouched, and somehow louder than everything else in the room. Emma stared at it from across the bed like it might open itself and speak aloud the truth she both feared and needed. She hadn't told her mother it had arrived. She hadn't even told herself she was ready. But the truth had already taken root, and it wouldn't wait much longer. That morning, the sky was gray, the kind of gray that made you wonder whether the sun would ever bother showing up. Emma moved like someone underwater, each motion slow, waited. She showered, dressed, tied her hair back, all the small rituals of normalcy, but her eyes kept drifting back to the nightstand. When she finally sat down, her hands didn't tremble. They were steady, calm in a way that made her more afraid than anything. She peeled the envelope open with surgical precision. The paper inside made a soft sound, almost apologetic. One line stood out immediately, printed in bold, clinical font that left no room for doubt. Probability of relationship, 99.9%. Biological father, Richard Hale. The room seemed to narrow around her. Her breath caught, but she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even move for a full minute. Just stared at the words, the facts, the end of the question she'd carried like a second skin for so long. When she finally stood, it was with the kind of clarity that comes only after certainty. She slid the papers back into the envelope, tucked it into her coat pocket, and left the apartment without a word. The air outside was brisk, but she didn't notice. The city moved around her, cars, voices, footsteps, and yet she walked in silence. A woman on a mission with nothing left to lose. The officers' club came into view like a monument she'd been approaching her whole life. Her steps didn't falter. She entered without pause, without checking the time, because she already knew he'd be there. She always knew. There was something about Hale's routines, precise, predictable, military, and today, that certainty worked in her favor. Admiral Hale sat at table 9, same posture, same white uniform, same silver streak at his temples catching the window light. But when he saw her, something in his face shifted, not alarm, not fear, but recognition. She didn't smile. Didn't ask if he needed anything. She walked straight to his table, pulled the envelope from her coat, and placed it beside his plate. The motion was simple, clean, intentional. She didn't sit, didn't linger. She just looked at him and said, "Read it." Then she stepped back, arms crossed, and waited. Hale looked down at the envelope as though it might detonate. His hand hovered over it for a moment before he picked it up. He opened it carefully, like a man who already knew what he was about to see. And when he read the contents, his shoulders sagged just enough to betray everything he felt. His lips parted, the paper trembling slightly in his grip. "I never knew," he whispered, eyes not leaving the page. The words were soft, honest. But to Emma, they weren't enough. Not after all this time. Not after the silence that had carved itself into the shape of her entire life. "You should have," she said, her voice calm but sharp. Hale looked up then, his expression cracked open, guilt and disbelief woven into every line on his face. He looked at her like he was seeing a daughter he'd never imagined and now couldn't unsee. "Claire never told me," he said, almost defensively, but Emma didn't flinch. "Maybe," she replied, "but you never looked back either." Her words hung in the space between them like truth carved in stone. The room around them continued to hum, officers eating, servers moving, glasses clinking, but for them, the world had narrowed to this single moment. Hale reached up and removed the ring from his finger. He placed it on the table beside the test results, the emerald catching the light like a memory finally set free. "This was the only thing I kept," he said. "Everything else I tried to leave behind." His voice was quiet, heavy. Emma's gaze dropped to the ring. Its twin sat in her mother's drawer, buried under sweaters and years of heartbreak. "She kept hers too," Emma said. She never forgot. For the first time, Hale seemed to truly understand the weight of what he'd left behind. Not just a woman, but a life. "I'm not asking for anything," Emma added, before he could speak again. "I'm not here because I want something from you." She took a breath. "I just needed to know." Her voice softened slightly. "And now I do." Hale nodded slowly, but he didn't speak. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life commanding fleets, only to be sunk by a truth he never saw coming. Emma stepped back from the table. Her heart thundered, but her expression remained composed. She had done what she came to do. As she turned to walk away, she didn't look back. Not at the ring. Not at the man who wore it for decades without knowing why it still mattered. But Hale watched her go, his eyes following her like someone watching the tide retreat, knowing it's taken something with it. Something that might never return, but had left its mark all the same. Emma exited into the cool afternoon light, the envelope still in her coat, though it no longer felt heavy. Her steps were slow now, thoughtful. She wasn't sure what came next. She only knew that the question that had haunted her was finally answered, and that answer lived behind the eyes of a man she would never see the same way again. Behind her, at table 9, Admiral Richard Hale remained seated. The ring sat beside the coffee cup, the envelope beside the ring, and the silence that followed Emma's exit spoke louder than any revelation he had ever faced in uniform. He picked up the photograph from his journal, the one of Claire smiling, unguarded, unaware. And for the first time in his life, he saw Emma's face there too. He had missed her whole childhood. Missed birthdays, questions, scraped knees, and quiet nights. And now he wondered if there was any way to step into a life that had already grown without him. The cafe on the corner of 6th and Harbor was smaller than the officers' club, quieter, homier, the kind of place where people came for routine comfort, not formal power. Emma liked it for that reason. She could wear her hair loose, her apron messy, her smile real. There were no uniforms here, no medals, no weight of history waiting behind every nod. And yet, that afternoon, she felt the shift the moment the bell above the door jingled. She turned from the espresso machine and saw him, not in dress whites, but a navy sweater and beige slacks that made him look more like a professor than a military man. Admiral Richard Hale stood just inside the entrance, looking uncertain in a way she'd never seen before. He scanned the room and found her. For a moment, neither moved. Then she raised an eyebrow, a silent question, and he took it as permission. He approached slowly, hat in hand, stopping just short of the counter. "Didn't expect to find you here," he said, though clearly he had. Emma didn't respond immediately. She pulled a rag from her apron and wiped the counter once. "People like you usually don't come to places like this," she replied. He gave a faint smile. "Maybe I've been going to the wrong places." Emma didn't smile back. She motioned to the corner table near the window. Sit if you want. But I'm working. I don't have time for speeches. I'm not here to make one, he said. Just wanted a cup of coffee. She gave him a once-over, skeptical, but didn't argue. Instead, she walked to the back, poured a cup, and brought it over in silence. He thanked her. She nodded and walked away. For the next few days, he came in regularly, never pushing, never prying. Always ordering the same thing, black coffee, no sugar. He'd sit at the same table and watch the street more than he watched her. Sometimes he'd read the paper, sometimes he'd just sit. Emma pretended not to notice, but she did every time. Eventually, their conversations began to shift from "How are you?" to "Do you always work Sundays?" From neutral to something less guarded. One day, he mentioned a dog he'd had as a boy. Another, he told her he'd always wanted to be a writer before the Navy pulled him in. Emma listened, occasionally responding with a short question or dry comment. But she didn't walk away. He started telling her about his childhood, growing up near the coast, fishing with his brothers, the smell of salt and old rope. She watched him as he spoke, wondering how a man who had lived so much could have left so much behind. Sometimes he stumbled over memories. Other times he laughed quietly, like the sound surprised even him. And slowly, Emma found herself listening more than she meant to. One afternoon, during a lull between customers, she brought him a refill without asking. He looked up and gave her a softer smile than usual. "Thank you," he said. She shrugged. "You tip better than most," she replied, but her voice had lost some of its edge. They talked a little longer that day. He asked about school, and she told him she had taken some classes, mostly online, mostly when she could afford it. He asked about music, and she mentioned an old piano her mom used to play. He asked about her favorite memory. She paused, then said, "Riding my bike down the pier with the wind in my face. Like I could outpace everything." He nodded thoughtfully. "I had one of those memories too." Emma tilted her head. "Do you remember your daughter's first memory?" she asked, instantly regretting the sharpness in her voice. Hale didn't flinch. "No," he said. "But I wish I did." The silence that followed wasn't angry. It was full, weighted, necessary. Emma stood there a moment longer before walking back to the counter, heart pounding against the walls she'd started letting down. Each day after that, their words came easier, but not lighter. They talked about regrets like trading old coins. He told her about the letter he never sent, the fear that kept him from trying to find her. She told him about birthdays spent wondering why her family was smaller than everyone else's. Neither of them said the word father. Neither had to. It hung in the air every time she brought him coffee. One rainy Tuesday, the cafe was nearly empty, the soft tap of water against the windows like background music to their strange ritual. Hale sat by the window, hands wrapped around his mug, staring out as the clouds rolled. Emma cleaned nearby, glancing at him now and then. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Not coming back?" His response was immediate. "Every day." She didn't answer right away. Sometimes, she said, "I wonder what would have been different. If I'd known." "If you had?" Hale looked at her with something just shy of sorrow. "I wonder that too." Another moment passed. Then she asked, "Why now? Why start coming here?" He hesitated. "Because I didn't know how to fix anything. But I thought maybe I could show up." It wasn't the answer she expected, but it wasn't the worst one either. That afternoon, she brought him a slice of pie without charging him. "On the house," she said. He looked at it, then at her. "That's progress," he said with a grin. "Don't get cocky," she replied, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward. By the end of the week, something had changed. The space between them wasn't filled with fire anymore, it was filled with questions that didn't burn as much. He asked fewer things. But what he did ask mattered. Like he was building something, plank by plank, and checking to see if she'd let him. One day, as she wiped down the counter and he stood to leave, he paused. His hand hovered over the table, unsure. "Emma," he said. She turned, arms crossed, brow lifted. "Would it be too much if I asked to see your mother?" Her face didn't change. Not at first. But her eyes did, narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached beneath the counter, pulled out a receipt pad, tore off the top page, and wrote something down. She folded the paper neatly and walked it over to him. "This is where she lives," Emma said quietly. "And the day she doesn't work." Hale took the note carefully, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, not a yes, not a no, just a start. Have you ever tried rebuilding a bridge you thought was long gone? Share your story in the comments, because second chances often start with the smallest step. The Officers' Club looked the same as it always had, all gleaming brass, quiet music, and the faint scent of polished wood and nostalgia. For Admiral Richard Hale, the place carried ghosts he hadn't known were waiting for him. He arrived early, out of habit, his posture still disciplined though his heart wasn't. The years had weathered his face, but not his memory. He sat at table 9, hands folded, waiting for the past to walk through the door. Claire Brooks entered quietly, her steps steady but hesitant. She wasn't the young woman he remembered, and yet, somehow, she was exactly the same. Her hair was streaked with silver, her features softer, wiser, like someone who had lived through storms and learned to stay standing. For a moment, she paused by the doorway, taking in the room, the uniforms, the ghosts of old promises. Then her eyes found him. Hale stood as she approached. "Claire," he said, and the single word nearly undid him. She gave a polite nod, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "Richard." She didn't extend her hand, and he didn't expect her to. Instead, she sat, the silence between them filling quickly, not heavy, just real. The waiter approached, but Hale waved him off. "Not yet." His voice was softer now, stripped of authority. "I didn't ask you here for formality." Claire looked at him, eyes calm but alert. "Then why did you?" she asked. "After all this time." He took a deep breath, his gaze drifting to the emerald ring glinting faintly under the light. "Because I should have years ago," he said. "There's no excuse that would matter now. But when I saw her, when I realized, I knew I owed you more than silence." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and for the first time in decades, Richard Hale looked nothing like an admiral. He just looked like a man who regretted everything that had mattered. Claire folded her hands, the faintest sigh escaping her lips. "I spent years hating you," she said quietly. "Not because you left people leave, but because I let myself believe you wouldn't." Her words weren't cruel. They were honest, measured, like the kind of truth you only speak when time has made you brave enough. Hale nodded slowly, absorbing each word like penance. "I should have come back," he said. "I told myself it was mercy, that I was protecting you from the kind of life I lived. But that was a lie. It was fear." He looked down, fingers curling against the tablecloth. "I was afraid that coming back would mean facing everything I'd abandoned." He paused, his throat tightening. "You. Her. The life I threw away." Claire studied him quietly. "She doesn't hate you," she said after a long pause. "But she doesn't trust you either. I don't think she knows how to." Hale nodded. "I don't blame her," he replied. "You both had to live with my absence. I only had to live with the memory of it." The room around them continued as if untouched, servers passing, laughter rising from distant tables, but at table 9, time stood still. Hale reached into his pocket and took out his ring, setting it gently between them. "I kept it," he said. "Even when I told myself to forget. I couldn't." The emerald glimmered under the chandelier, its reflection catching in Claire's eyes. "It was supposed to mean a future," she whispered. But it became a reminder. She reached into her purse and drew out the twin, the same emerald, the same band, untouched by time. She placed it beside his, the two stones gleaming together for the first time in decades. "That chapter ended," she said softly. "But maybe hers can begin." For a moment, neither of them breathed. Hale's gaze lingered on the rings, then lifted to her face. "She has your strength," he said. "And your quiet." Claire smiled faintly, shaking her head. "She has your stubbornness," she replied. They both laughed then, softly, ruefully, like people who had forgotten what shared laughter felt like. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Hale said after a moment. "I don't deserve it." Claire met his eyes, steady. "You're right," she said. "But forgiveness isn't something earned. It's something lived." Her words landed gently, not sharp but firm enough to stay. He leaned forward slightly, voice low. I just want the chance to know her, properly this time. Claire tilted her head, studying him the way one studies a photograph that used to mean everything. You'll have to move carefully, she said. She doesn't open easily. Not anymore. Her tone was protective, but not bitter. Just maternal. They fell silent again, the two emerald rings between them glinting like tiny beacons of what was lost and what might still be found. Hale reached out but stopped short of touching them. You kept it, he said again, still in disbelief. Claire nodded. Not for you, she said softly. For her. Hale nodded too, understanding at last. Then maybe, he said, it's time they belong to her. He pushed his ring gently toward Claire. Both of them. She looked down at the stones, the past, reduced to two small circles of gold and promise, and closed her hand over them without a word. When the meeting ended, there were no grand gestures, no tears. Only two people who had once shared a life that never got to exist, now sitting in the quiet aftermath of honesty. Hale stood first, offering a small nod instead of a goodbye. Claire stood too, collecting her bag and the rings. Their eyes met one last time, not as lovers, but as the co-authors of the same unfinished story. As Hale stepped outside, the evening air greeted him with the chill of closure. He inhaled deeply, as though filling his lungs with the years he'd missed. Across the street, behind the window of the cafe next door, a familiar figure stood watching. Emma's hands were pressed against the glass, her reflection framed by the amber light. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched her mother and the man who had changed everything part ways. Hale didn't see her, not at first. But when he turned, his eyes caught hers for a brief, electric second, recognition flashing between them like a signal neither of them fully understood. She didn't move. Neither did he. And then, without a word, he walked away into the night. The weeks that followed didn't change everything overnight, but they changed enough. Richard Hale no longer walked through life with the certainty of command, but with the quiet humility of a man trying to make up for time he'd let slip through his fingers. He stopped showing up at the officers' club and started appearing at the cafe more often, not always to talk, sometimes just to be there. He never wore his uniform when he came. Emma noticed that first. Their conversations were still careful, but not cold. She no longer watched him like a stranger, but she didn't call him Dad either. That word had weight, and she wasn't ready to lift it just yet. Still, she didn't flinch when he asked how her week had been, or whether she still played piano. Sometimes, she answered with a smile. And sometimes, she stayed silent, but he stayed anyway. Claire saw it all from a distance, like someone watching the tide slowly come back in. She never interrupted. Never forced the process. She let Emma come home in silence some days, and on others, she let her talk until the sun went down. She knew what it was to carry a wound long enough that it began to look like part of you. One Saturday morning, Richard arrived early. The cafe wasn't even open yet, but Emma was inside, wiping down tables before the first regulars shuffled in. She saw him through the glass, hesitated, then unlocked the door. We're not open, she said, but there was no real edge in her voice. I know, he replied. I just wanted to say good morning. She let him in and handed him a coffee without asking. He smiled, genuinely now, not the strained, apologetic kind he wore before. They sat near the window, the morning light spilling across the floor like gold ribbon. Outside, the street was still waking up. Inside, time moved slower, easier. Do you remember your first birthday? She asked suddenly. He chuckled. Mine? Barely. But I remember my son's. She nodded, thoughtful. I don't remember mine. But Mom used to tell me I cried through the whole thing. He listened without interrupting. That was new. He'd spent so long giving orders, but now he was learning how to just be present. She said, Emma added, I wouldn't let go of a stuffed bear all day. She glanced over at him. I still have it. He smiled again, this time with something like wonder. I'd like to see it someday. Emma didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She looked down at her coffee, then back at him. You missed a lot. I know, he said, the words coming slow. I missed everything. And then, without hesitation, Emma reached into her apron and pulled out a folded photo. It was soft around the edges, clearly handled many times. She placed it gently on the table between them. The image showed a much younger Claire holding a baby, wrapped in a knitted blanket, cheeks round, eyes wide and blinking. Claire looked radiant in the photo, exhausted but full of something sacred. Emma didn't say anything as he studied it. Hale's hand hovered over the picture before he finally picked it up. His mouth opened once, but no words came. After a long moment, she spoke. "Then don't miss what's left." The words hit him harder than anything else had. Not as blame, not as punishment, but as an invitation. From that day forward, his visits changed. They became regular, then expected, then wanted. He came by on Wednesdays to walk her home when her shift ended. On Fridays, he brought her mother's favorite scones. On Sundays, they sat in the park and talked not about the Navy, but about things like books, food, and whether Emma had ever learned to swim. Sometimes, Claire joined them. Sometimes she didn't. But when she did, she watched them from the bench with quiet gratitude. It was never what she imagined, but somehow it was still something good. Not perfect, but possible. One evening, as autumn settled into the corners of the city, Hale knocked on the door of Claire's apartment. Emma answered, surprised. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded and lifted a small wooden box. "Thought you might want this," he said. Inside was the twin emerald ring. The one Claire had returned to him. The one he now wanted Emma to have. "You don't have to wear it," he said quickly. "But you should have it." She took the box slowly. Her fingers hovered over the ring before she closed the lid. "Maybe not yet," she whispered. "But someday." That night, she placed it in the same drawer where her mother had once kept hers, no longer hidden, just waiting. And in the morning, she opened the drawer and smiled. Some stories aren't meant to end with closure, but with continuation. Emma still had questions, and Hale still had guilt. But they had coffee now and Thursday walks and the first thread of something like a bond. Not bound by blood alone, but by effort. By the choice to show up. And slowly, Emma found herself asking about his favorite food, his worst deployment, the best book he'd ever read. He asked if she had a favorite flower, if she remembered her first piano recital, if she still liked chocolate chip anything. The answers came easier now. One night, as they sat outside under string lights, Hale leaned back and looked up at the sky. "It took me too long to come back," he said. "I missed the beginning." Emma sipped her tea and looked at him, not as a stranger, but not quite as a father yet. "That's okay," she said softly. "You're here for the rest." Sometimes, Claire would peek into the room where they sat and pause in the doorway. She wouldn't say anything, just listen. And sometimes, she would catch her daughter laughing, a sound she hadn't heard in years. It was a different kind of healing. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a series of quiet moments strung together like pearls on a thread. And none of them needed to say it out loud. They all knew they were writing a new story. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.